All right, great. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's edition of Conversations on Ocean Carbon, a U.S. West Coast and Alaska perspective. This is a webinar series that is aiming to deliver the best available information on marine carbon dioxide removal, mCDR, and to explore concepts related to coastal ocean carbon. We're working together to create a dialogue among industry members, tribes, natural resource managers, and scientists throughout the West Coast and Alaska to provide a better understanding of marine carbon removal technologies, the state of the science, and ways to become engaged in this field. We want to thank all of you who have joined us for previous webinars, and those recordings can be found on YouTube, and we'll put that link in the chat. My name is Darcy Dugan, and I am with the Alaska Ocean Observing System based in Anchorage, and I'm the director of the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network. And our network is one of 6 ocean acidification networks around the U.S. that are bringing together scientists, resource managers, industry, tribes, and coastal communities to expand the understanding of ocean acidification and also explore adaptation and mitigation options. And let's see, I'll change the slide here. This webinar is co-hosted by the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network, the California Current Acidification Network, and the California Ocean Science Trust. And I'm joined today by my co-hosts, who are Lauren Linsmeyer and Kevin Travis with the California Ocean Science Trust. And also Lauren will be moderating Q&A. We also have Emma Stone with the California Ocean Science Trust, who is working behind the scenes today to make sure that our webinar is running smoothly. And we also want to thank Alexander Puritz with NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program and Alex Harper with the California Current Ocean Acidification Network for supporting our series this year. Before we introduce today's speakers, we're going to start off with 2 poll questions. And these are there to help us and you get a sense of who is on our call today. So Lauren's going to put a poll question up. What best describes your relationship with mCDR? So we'll give everybody just a minute to answer that question. Great. And Lauren, when you see kind of a critical mass that's responded, we can view the result. Great. Okay. So it looks like we have maybe equal parts of active member of the mCDR project and currently not involved but tracking the issue. And then we have a few people that are thinking about mCDR projects and on either the regulatory side or the funding side. So thank you for that. Our next poll question is, where do you live or work? This will help us get a sense of the geographic representation today. Great. And Lauren, here we go. Okay. Looks like some kind of a spectrum today. So pretty good contingent outside the US, other parts of the US, Washington, California, Alaska, and a few folks from Oregon. So thank you for helping us all kind of get a sense of who is here since we can't see you. Okay, let's see. Let's go to today's agenda. The title of today's session is Community and Public Engagement on mCDR, the Need, Current Efforts, and Approaches. And we have 3 speakers, Sarah Nawaz from American University, Adam Subhas from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and Grace Andrews from Hourglass Consulting. We'll have 90 minutes for our session today, and each presentation will be about 15 minutes, and then we'll do a moderated Q&A at the end. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so you can type questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we will be able to pose those questions to speakers after all of the presentations. And before our first speaker, we have 2 more poll questions. We know that this webinar is about community engagement, but seeing that it's around field trials, we're hoping to get a pulse on how people are feeling about field trials in general. So this is, how do you currently feel about mCDR field trials? Okay. And the answer there, again, there's a spectrum, but it looks like majority feel supportive. Great. And then last poll question before our speakers is, what describes your experience with community engagement around mCDR field trials? Okay. You can check out those results. Okay, so it looks like about half of the people on the call have not yet been involved in community or public engagement. And then a few of each of the other type. There's developers that have been, researchers that have been, and just a few community members that have been involved. So thank you for um, answering those questions. And we will move to our first speaker, who is Sarah Nawaz. And Sarah is the Director of Research at American University's Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy. She is an environmental social scientist who works on social dimensions of carbon removal, including how carbon removal technologies and policies might be designed in just, equitable, and responsible ways. And today, Sarah is going to be providing an academic perspective on why community engagement is important and the needs, challenges, and current expectations. So, Sarah, I'm going to stop sharing here and I will pass it off to you. Let's see.
Awesome. Can you all see my screen now?
Looks great.
Great. Okay, fantastic. Well, it's great to be here with you all. I'm really excited to talk about this topic, and yeah, I'm going to discuss today a little bit about I think why we should be engaging communities on marine CDR. I'll share my perspectives, in particular informed by my background as an environmental social scientist. I'm also the director of research at, as Darcy mentioned, the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University, where we are thinking a lot about what it takes to research and deploy carbon removal in sort of ways that are responsible and just and equitable and also effective. So briefly, I'm going to do a very brief kind of re-intro to mCDR for folks who aren't as familiar. I'll talk about what community engagement is, why we should be doing it, and what it really means to do it well. I'll share my own sort of reflections on what I think the marine CDR sector really needs to tackle to ensure that engagement supports responsible and effective deployment. And hopefully I'll have time at the end to talk about some findings from my own engagement research that I've done on marine CDR. I might go a bit over time, but I think I got the thumbs up that that was okay. So um, the organizers can cut me off if I ramble too long. So for probably very not, not necessary information for most folks on the call, but for folks that this is necessary for, carbon removal, there's sort of defining it, there's sort of a longer and shorter answer. The short answer is removing CO2 from the atmosphere, storing it. And a couple important points that we try to talk about are it had this, it's essential for it to be carbon removal, for that carbon to come from the atmosphere rather than captured during the burning of fossil fuels. This has to be additional carbon, so more than what would otherwise have occurred. And it has to be stored for a long time. Long time can be defined in different ways, but generally thinking about more like hundreds of thousands of years rather than shorter time frames than that. And it's really important to talk about carbon removal in the context of broader decarbonization and emissions reduction. So if we think about that kind of purple area as or the purple space and the kind of purple line being what we need to do to kind of get down to net zero. A lot of this is that is all emissions reductions and decarbonization, but you'll see there's also that kind of yellow piece of the graph where that's the amount of carbon dioxide removal we'll need to do to get to net zero by 2050. And there's lots of different ways to do carbon removal and a lot of really exciting and promising ways to take advantage of the ocean and marine spaces. And so some of the technologies that are on the table for discussion are things like growing macroalgae and sinking it, Ocean fertilization involves adding nutrients to the ocean to stimulate additional primary production. And then you have sort of the carbon filtering into the deeper ocean. Um, Alkalinity enhancement is something I'll talk a bit about. I'm working a lot on, and so are others on this call, um, involving the addition of alkaline materials to the ocean to cause the ocean to draw down and durably store atmospheric CO2, and other ways as well that I won't get into right now. But hopefully that's a bit of a primer or background for folks who are less familiar. So switching quickly to community engagement, really the way that I think about engagement is essentially encompassing processes by which different groups are involved in making decisions that affect them. So it's quite a broad definition, but I think there's a couple points to really note here. Community engagement is not public relations or marketing, so it's not about trying to convince groups of people how to think. It's really should be something that is hosted in a sort of unbiased way by an unbiased facilitator using kind of more neutral information as much as possible. It involves sharing information and educating and communicating information, but um, I think that with like something like marine CDR, you're really focusing on learning in addition to discussion and deliberation. So yeah, making sure that with a complex subject like marine CDR, there's a lot of attention to helping people grapple with all the complexities and nuances involved in a complex topic like marine CDR. And I kind of think about two broad reasons as to why we want to be doing engagement. So the first is kind of ethical, justice oriented. People have the right to participate in decisions that affect them. But also, I think there's a pragmatic reason, which is that there's a ton of scholarship that's demonstrated that projects are just simply more likely to get shut down and not progress without engagement. Engagement doesn't happen. And I think this is particularly the case for new technologies or new classes of technologies like marine CDR, where social license hasn't necessarily been established yet, and one bad experience or one sort of negative experience can kind of have spillover effects on other projects or related tech. And community is a pretty broad word, so I think it's worth spending a couple moments talking about who that includes. Generally, when I'm talking about community, I'm referring to potentially affected and interested groups and those with rights relevant to the broader project area, so indigenous communities. And yeah, these communities can be, anyone from shellfish farmers, local residents, it might be workers at a port or in the mining industry that's supplying minerals for alkalinity enhancement, and so forth. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that there isn't sort of one objective, single, clear community in terms of especially who's going to kind of show up and participate at a workshop or an activity. Attention really needs to be given to access. So who can most easily participate, I think is something to really keep in mind and give attention to. And maybe one other note here around who the community is that this answering this question is a lot easier when we're talking about coastal deployments or coastal research versus things happening in the open ocean. So that's a bit of a can of worms we can get into maybe in the Q&A if folks are interested. And I think about, and well, this is not my spectrum, but I talk about what it means to do engagement well is really a lot of attention towards shifting from lesser degrees of community participation in a project to greater degrees. And so moving along this kind of nice spectrum we have, we're talking about shifting from approaches like outreach, where you've got sort of a one-way sharing of information, to consultation, where you're also receiving information from a community, moving along to sort of involving a community, considering their goals and concerns and decisions, and then keeping going along to the right, collaboration, where you're actually viewing communities and treating communities as partners that are involved in actively building outcomes. And then on the far right of the spectrum, something called shared leadership, where you're actually potentially sharing decision-making power with the community, or the community actually is the one sort of making the final decision about something project related. And I just wanted to flag, this kind of gets to some of my own research I'll talk about a bit later, but just some examples of how engagement can look that goes beyond what I think maybe a lot of us think of, which is sort of, a town hall or a listening session. So I'll just give three examples of methods I've used with colleagues in my own work. And the first is we basically tried to talk about technologies at scale and sort of at scale across the full life cycle of the tech. So in this case, we talked to folks about what it would look like to do a specific technology at the 2 megaton scale, which was 10% of British Columbia's annual removal need in the next few decades. So really trying to calibrate our discussion to, okay, what would this look like tangibly to do this at that scale? I've used future scenarios that we've written that ask people to consider a range of different, not only technical options for deployment and for research, but also different sort of social configurations, things around ownership, monitoring, and funding, and so forth. And something we did most recently was a card game where we asked folks to design their ideal ocean alkalinity enhancement system, and then explored at the end of the card game whether that's like a system that they would actually want to see developed in their community or not. So lots of creative possibilities far beyond these examples I've shared for how to facilitate some of these rich conversations with communities about mCDR. And I wanted to turn now to talking a little bit about what I think is wrong with the sort of common or default approach to how community engagement tends to happen around sort of big infrastructure projects, like how it happens in other sectors, essentially. I'm talking a lot about my perspective as a social scientist, but a lot of the time community engagement is something that's being led by developers and in sort of infrastructure developers, let's say. So in these cases, we're talking about communities not really impacting decisions. They might only be learning about one specific technology that the developer kind of wants to pursue. The developers don't necessarily have a huge incentive to integrate what communities really want into decision making. Engagement is something that's happening quite late in the decision process, maybe, around the permitting stage, which is often far too late for, something to actually meaningfully change for a project. And there also isn't a lot of learning sharing across different projects or between developers. So, my thought, and this is a a scholarly critique that's been made by not just me, but many folks, is that engagement ends up functioning in as sort of a performative, symbolic thing, and really functions to push projects through rather than actually make them more aligned with what communities really want to see. And as I mentioned earlier, I think this is risky. This is a risky default way to go for something like marine CDR, where there is sort of this social license risk that is particularly salient at the beginning, sort of early on in a technology's development process. So I think what we need to be doing, in my view, at a sort of sector level for mCDR is a couple of things. One is really trying to be efficient and strategic about how we use what is essentially very limited bandwidth that folks have for engagement. So how can we do this in a more coordinated and strategic way? How can we think across technologies? So people want to talk not just about, one specific tech configuration, but other alternatives that could be considered, other totally different technologies, or even just totally different options for energy and climate that they think are relevant. And so how do we kind of think across options and technologies and have that conversation? Um, I think engagement needs to be facilitated by an independent actor. So someone who doesn't have a material incentive in any one particular outcome can really better support sharing of feedback. And I think we also need to be kind of trying to systematically learn from engagement, having some sort of way to document and share in a transparent way what kind of learnings are coming out of it. So I've been thinking a lot about the idea of regional level sort of engagement hubs where there's some kind of body that is tasked with doing engagement. Not just a single developer, but a coalition of actors from public to private sector, universities, civil society perhaps involved to kind of lead this work. And I think it could look a lot of different ways and probably would need to, depending on the context. But at the core, my sense is the idea is that engagement would be treated as something that's independently led, coordinated, sort of coordinated effort. And just to kind of come back to this earlier little diagram I showed, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the options for what can be done on the sort of more right side of the spectrum, more collaborative, more shared leadership approaches to increasing participation and doing engagement in kind of a more participatory way. And a couple things that I wanted to share about are first this idea of citizens' assemblies, which is an approach that's been used in the UK, for example, such as around helping decisions around reaching net zero targets. And the idea is, a representative sample of the public selected via civic lottery. Folks gather, they vote in a secret ballot to make a sort of recommendation or decision. Australia, these have happened in various different countries, but one example there on genetically modified foods, a sort of consensus conference model where you have citizens, again, randomly selected, brought into dialogue with experts. And then there's a sort of citizens panel report that's produced at the end of this process that kind of puts forward citizen views. Deliberative mapping is another example of a kind of more collaborative approach where you have, in the UK, this was done with disposal of radioactive waste, but it's involving, again, panels and groups of publics and experts that come together. And in the end, with this case, they produce a sort of quantitative ranking of different options that might be on the table for dealing with this issue. So none of these are just examples that, none of these is directly, I think, exactly works for mCDR, but I think these maybe can be inspirations for different models that could be applied to this sector in conversation. So I'll take a couple extra minutes to briefly chat about a few of my own research projects where we were doing mCDR engagement research, and the goal was really to understand what do people think about mCDR, and under what conditions do people support or reject further research and deployment. Um, I thought it'd just be interesting to share some empirics from that work. So just to wrap up. So the projects that I'll talk about, all in the Pacific Northwest, two in British Columbia, Vancouver, and Victoria, and then the third in Washington State in Sequim. And I should say the first in Victoria, the Victoria one was part of an academic feasibility study of an offshore DAX system. But we also took the opportunity to talk to folks about ocean alkalinity enhancement and marine biomass sinking. And then the second was a standalone social science research study on ocean alkalinity enhancement, but really informed by the fact that trials in that region are underway or planned, I should say. And so it's a conversation that we figured would be good to have in that context. And then the third kind of ongoing project is around a field trial that's planned in Vancouver, BC in ocean alkalinity enhancement. So I'll just what I should say, these were all day-long workshops. So we spent about 6 or 7 hours talking to folks about CDR and marine CDR and specific technologies. And I wish I could say I could talk about this for a lot longer, but just a couple really high-level findings. Um, people's views changed a lot as we kind of got deeper and deeper into the details. So we started out the day and people wanted to talk a lot about marine ecological impacts, does mCDR work? But there was a lot of growth and shifting and kind of changes in how people were talking and thinking as the days went on. And that was true across all three studies. Scale really like people offering people the opportunity to think about scale really changed their views in all sorts of ways. One way was, thinking about naturalness, and they might have a preference for one method or really liked that something seemed really natural. And then when we talked about doing it at scale, that changed for folks. And other folks didn't want to have the conversation until it was something that was being done in scale. A lot of conversations around life cycle, so mining, energy use, people really caring a lot about these kind of other linked industries that mCDR is connected to. And something that we've also found that was around preferences for integration. So folks really preferring approaches that used existing infrastructure or byproducts rather than those that kind of needed kind of generation of new materials or building of new infrastructure. And a final point is that ownership and financing were really common conversations across all of these. People really wanted to talk about the money and who has a say, coming full circle to this, to the sort of need for engagement and need for participation. Last thing I'll say before wrapping up is just to plug some work that I'm really excited about that my institute is doing with Seaworthy. We're basically aiming to be building capacity on marine CDR decision making in advance of larger deployments in two different locations, BC and Washington, trying to explore a model for community participation and informing decision making with this kind of idea of community advisory boards. And something we're also really excited about is involving communities in the development of oceanographic scenarios to kind of help folks think through possible mCDR futures. And so hoping to have some things to share about that in the coming year or two. So that's all I got. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. That was a great foundation for how to think about community engagement in this space. And we'll be taking questions in the question box that we'll be asking at the end of the three speakers. So please add your questions and we will make sure to bring them up. Our next speaker is Adam Subhas, and Adam is an associate scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Research Institution. He studies the marine calcium carbonate cycle and how it interacts with other aspects of carbon cycling in the ocean. And today he will be sharing his perspective on community engagement based on his involvement in an mCDR project called Locking Away Ocean Carbon in the Northeast Shelf and Slope, referred to as Loch Ness. So, Adam, if you want to share your screen, uh, it's all yours.
There we go. What do you see? Are you seeing my presenter mode or the?
It looks good. We're seeing, I
Looks
think, what we're
good.
supposed to see. Yep.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Darcy, and the other panelists, Sarah and Grace, and you all for being here. I'm looking forward to sharing some of the perspectives that we've um, been generating through the Loch Ness project here in the Northeast. I'm based out of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Um, I, just a statement about WHOI's overall position in this mCDR space. You know, we're a nonprofit educational and research organization. We prioritize independent research. We focus on improving observations of the ocean, um, extensive collaboration, and a commitment to ethical and inclusive science. And we do have a statement on marine CDR research specifically that you can find at this QR code. And in the spirit of collaboration, you know, I do want to acknowledge that this project is quite large. We have a number of folks here at WHOI working on the project, spanning almost every department. So I'm in the marine chemistry and geochemistry department. We have colleagues in the biology department, in physical oceanography, applied ocean physics and engineering, and the geology and geology department. We also have collaborators at Rutgers University, at MBARI. We are working with a autonomous glider manufacturer, MRV Systems. And pertinent to this work, you know, I just want to, you know, make a big shout out to the WHOI Communications Group and also to a new collaboration with the Environmental Defense Fund on some of the engagement work that I'll be talking about today. Who are we and how do we kind of position ourselves in this space? We're an interdisciplinary team of over 20 scientists, engineers, and communicators, and we're committed to a transparent, rigorous, and scientific evaluation of ocean alkalinity enhancement. Loch Ness is not a company selling carbon credits, and we are not participating in the carbon market. The research project overall is designed to answer key questions about the effectiveness and the environmental impacts of ocean alkalinity enhancement in seawater. And while we are proposing an in-water experiment field trial, we are not endorsing alkalinity enhancement as a large-scale climate solution. This is really to evaluate whether it could be. And so this project shouldn't be taken as what scaled up ocean alkalinity enhancement might end up looking like. Although we've used sodium, we're using sodium hydroxide as our alkalinity source. We're also not endorsing that for the use of OAE for the purposes of marine CDR. What specifically are we doing? We're doing a whole lot of studying of regional data sets. So this is the region of interest here, the Northeast Shelf and Slope, where the Ness comes from. Here we are in Woods Hole on Cape Cod. There's a huge wealth of baseline data, everything from physics to chemistry to biology and ecology, that has been really critical for us to sort of contextualize what ocean alkalinity enhancement might look like in this region, from all of these different perspectives. We're conducting a whole suite of biological impact studies in the lab, in sort of cruises of opportunity and natural seawater samples. We're doing a series of geochemical tests and dispersal engineering, combined with ship wake modeling. We're doing a lot of engagement with communities who care about the impacts of ocean alkalinity enhancement in their regional waters here in the Northeast. And finally, we are proposing to do a liquid alkalinity dispersal plus water tracer dye with continuous shipboard and remote sensing monitoring. So just to put this in perspective, Sarah was talking about more coastal applications versus open ocean. Our project kind of sits in that in-between area where we are offshore, off of a ship, but not truly into the high seas. We're still operating in the US exclusive economic zone. What have the goals for our engagement efforts been to date? We're doing a lot of just public education about marine CDR in general. This is a very new topic, and people are just curious to know what it is, why people are pursuing it, and specifically why the ocean. I'll get to this, but there has been a fair amount of sort of mis and disinformation about our project in particular floating around due to sort of media coverage and social media campaigns. We also, though, have really sought direct feedback from communities concerned and interested in the project, and have made a concerted effort to incorporate that feedback where possible. And just to give you a sense of the overall timeline of the project, we launched this project in 2022. We, at that stage, even at this initial stage, we were thinking about regional communities, organizations, and groups who might be interested in this topic, and trying to map out who we should start engaging with when it came to planning and executing an in-water experiment. We had an academic debut in a sort of traditional workshop setting. We had a press release in 2023 when the actual project got launched. After that, we really focused on the research and logistics portion of the project. There were a number of things that happened with regards to permitting. The big thing that happened that really kind of kicked off the intensive engagement period was an interview that we did with the Wall Street Journal on our project, and specifically related to climate solutions and ocean alkalinity enhancement. And that really sort of opened up the door for a whole suite of people to start getting interested and curious about what we were doing. After that, we really started intensively engaging with a whole suite of folks ahead of the opening of the public comment in May. That first public comment period closed at the end of July. We then moved to really strategic engagement with a whole number of groups, including scaling up to fishery management councils in the region, as well as hosting our own events and participating in other expos and sessions. We actually just closed the second comment period on a revised permit application that we sent in a revision really based on and incorporating a lot of this feedback that we received over this engagement period. And so the engagement now that we're doing is really sort of much more on the educational side, expanding the groups that we're talking to, and again, switching over to a research and logistics focus as we gear up for the summer proposed experiment. So as you can see, this is a really long timeline. These engagement activities and the whole research timeline takes a long time. And so I think that's important to say that these two things really work in parallel. They work along with the permitting, and all of this really has to be taken into consideration from a pretty early stage in a project. We've received feedback from a whole suite of people. Oh, I forgot to edit this, but our new public comment period did close on February 14th. We've received, I think, 222 comments now on this federal permit. We went through consistency review with a number of federal agencies. We've done a whole suite of engagement events across a whole bunch of different sectors, local and national media interviews, and surveys and targeted feedback to start incorporating perspectives and research ideas directly from the communities that we've been engaging with. What have we learned about what communities are worried about when it comes to marine CDR? The number one thing that we have heard concerns about is the commercialization. So who's making money on this and the scale? How big does this need to get? How much material are we actually talking about adding to the oceans through ocean alkalinity enhancement? Where is that going to be done? Who benefits from that, and who pays for that material addition to the ocean? Obviously, the fishing community and indigenous communities are quite concerned about ecosystem impacts. Plankton and commercial fish larvae, these really sensitive early life stages that obviously fishermen care a lot about. Also impacts to higher trophic levels, things like marine mammals, larger fish species, turtles, endangered species, et cetera. And then finally, the other thing that is going to happen as other ocean uses come online is just really thinking about spatial squeeze and who is operating at the ocean at any given time, what those overlaps look like, and how to minimize interferences with existing ocean activities. I wouldn't spend too much time on this, but we've really tried hard to incorporate a lot of the feedback that we've gotten from these various engagement events and activities that we've hosted and been involved with. A whole suite of things, including some new collaborations with NOAA researchers, really having deep conversations with fishermen about what they're concerned about, what they'd like to see research being done on, and adjustments to the actual in-water experiment as well. And I just want to spend some time now on, we've done a whole lot of these engagement events, talked to a whole suite of different sectors and communities and peoples with a whole suite of different perspectives. And I just want to kind of walk through, this is going to be a lot of the same content that Sarah presented, but I'm going to sort of walk through why we've ended up with the sort of package of slides and framing that we have. What framing has worked for us when we've really gone to communities, met people where they are, and tried to introduce this really new and complex topic to them? The number one thing is we've really started by framing the climate goals and not necessarily the problem of climate change itself. Number two, we have found it very useful to acknowledge the moral hazard argument head on. So that this is not a replacement for large-scale emissions reductions, but it has to act as a supplement to those activities. Coming up with ways to visualize ocean alkalinity enhancement, its role in other industries, its current applications, positioning ourselves in this mCDR space that is very dynamic with a lot of different actors, and showing up, meeting people where they are at Fishery Management Council meetings, at fishermen's events, at community events, acknowledge these other values, viewpoints, and concerns, and try to incorporate that feedback into the research wherever possible. Sarah showed a version of this slide. I really like this slide because it does a few things. One, it sort of positions the climate solution, like what are the suite of processes that are being considered for large scale climate mitigation. The other thing it does is it directly addresses the moral hazard argument. And the way that it does that is if you were to just consider the negative emissions, the CDR piece of this, and superimpose that on the business as usual scenario, you do not get to 2 degrees Celsius, right? So there's no way in which CDR can act on its own to meet the climate goals that have been internationally recognized. And this is a really important point, and it's a point that I think we all should be making, that this is not a substitute for emissions reductions, but it needs to act in concert with large-scale emissions reductions and transition away from fossil fuels. We've also found it very useful to address why the ocean. Like, why are we talking about the ocean in the first place? This is a schematic of the various carbon reservoirs on the surface of the planet. And of course, your eye is immediately drawn to the immensely large oceanic reservoir of carbon that is there because it is alkaline. It is because the ocean is the ultimate repository for all of this alkalinity washing off of land, the dissolution of rocks and minerals, and the accumulation of a highly buffered system that is capable of storing all of this carbon and does so in a very sort of natural geochemical way. We've spent some time building visualizations of what ocean alkalinity enhancement is without the need to fall back on sort of complex carbonate chemistry or graphic or plots, XY plots. So in this schematic, we can show what the past ocean might have looked like with an acidic versus alkaline scale over here, what ocean acidification does, and then what ocean alkalinity enhancement does. By adding alkaline materials to seawater, you add buffering capacity, reduce its acidity, and make room for more carbon storage. We've also found it very useful to acknowledge other places and other applications of alkalinity enhancement. So for instance, river and ocean liming is an ongoing and very well-documented way to balance the pH of natural waters. It's very commonly used in all sorts of scenarios. It's also routinely used in shellfish aquaculture and in water treatment and food production. So these are just some of the things that we found helpful to highlight when introducing the concept of alkalinity enhancement. Now, of course, the concept of applying this to the oceans at the gigaton scale for climate mitigation is something completely different. And that's why we're doing this research, and that's why we're here today to talk through this stuff. We've also found it very helpful to acknowledge that we're not acting alone here. There's a private sector funded primarily through the voluntary carbon market that is pushing ahead, scaling these activities in the water today at scales that are moving out now of the thousands of tons and into the sort of hundreds of thousands of tons territory. And again, to recognize that this isn't just us, this carbon removal is becoming a fundamental part of the way that corporations are thinking about their carbon footprints and the ways that they're trying to mitigate their own carbon emissions through time, exemplified by Microsoft, who's a key buyer in this space. And finally, we do think it's important to highlight that this is not at the project level, but there are a whole suite of international and national resources that are calling for this research to be done. Some of you might have known that the White House actually took down this Marine CDR research strategy report. I'm happy to report that we have a PDF and it's hosted here on our project website. So that QR code goes to our project website and we have that FTAC report for you if you're interested. What are some of the goals of this research overall? Moving into the field really helps us evaluate the real-world efficacy and durability of carbon removal, helps to develop these MRV protocols using both in-water data and models. Of course, a huge thing that we've heard from communities is what about the environment? What about the biological system? We really need to spend some time thinking deeply about developing environmental monitoring protocols, environmental impact assessments, et cetera, and to help guide regulations to make sure that these deployments are happening in a safe and an ethical manner. And we're not doing so much of the technology testing, but that's certainly part of what the startups are doing. And then finally, I want to spend some time on this last one, which is a lot of this field research pushing into the field has been the catalyst for these broader societal conversations around marine CDR and its role in climate mitigation. There are a couple of goals here, right? So one is to just build literacy and confidence with the public in different sectors around talking about ocean alkalinity enhancement and marine CDR. And finally, assessing, how communities view and interact with mCDR research and now, private sector deployment. And I think it's important to recognize that this this effort, education, building literacy and confidence, does not necessarily lead to support. There will be groups, and there are groups who are vehemently opposed to marine CDR in all of its forms, just writ large, and then specifically around certain applications of projects, et cetera. So I just want to make this point that we should not be expecting this engagement to lead to support. We have seen just personally through this project, the development through building of literacy and confidence, the honing of sort of fear-mongering messaging campaigns on social media, the intentional misrepresentation or out of context presentation of information, things like mass signature and form letters, and alignment of these topics with other hot button ocean issues. So as this field continues to grow, we should also expect the opposition to be paying attention to what the industry and these researchers are saying, and for them to be developing their own sets of messages and tactics and strategies around building that opposition at the same time. So I just want to acknowledge that this is not a sort of like, it's great for everyone and everyone's going to be on board, but we really do need to acknowledge that not everyone is going to have the same value set when it comes to the benefits of marine CDR, and those perspectives are going to come out, and we have to acknowledge them and value that input in the decision-making process. So here's our website. Our funding sources are below. Happy to take any questions, and I'll hand it off from there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Adam. It's really interesting to hear about your experience and some of the take homes from the engagement process. We're getting some questions in the question box. Please add any questions for Adam, and we will ask them after our final speaker. And we will now have our final speaker, who is Grace Andrews. Grace is the founder and executive director of Hourglass Climate, which is a nonprofit research organization dedicated to advancing the science behind marine carbon dioxide removal. Grace is an aqueous geochemist and has spent her career studying the efficacy and safety of land and ocean-based carbon removal strategies, inclusive of 6 field trials across 3 continents. Today, she will be sharing a community engagement framework that she co-developed for mCDR, as well as examples of its implementation during 2 trials here in the US. So over to you, Grace.
Thanks so much. All right, can we see that?
Looks good.
Okay. All right, well, yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this. I thought I would just start by briefly describing who Hourglass Climate is. You may not have heard of us. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our mission, as said, is to research the safety and efficacy primarily of a type of marine carbon dioxide removal strategy called ocean alkalinity enhancement, which is the same type that Adam has been working on, and to make our work available to the public and in a timely manner. So one of our main goals is to make sure that as marine CDR strategies are being increasingly tested and commercialized, that sort of all stakeholders have access to trusted information about those strategies such that they can make informed decisions. So given that Hourglass's initiatives, we really fall into two buckets. So we build open source tools that help project developers plan projects responsibly through rigorous prediction and quantification of impacts and outcomes. But we also conduct and participate in field trials. And so through our involvement, we help to ensure that data is collected on an independent basis and transparently shared with stakeholders. So right now, Hourglass, we are involved in 3 marine CDR field trials. One is in Massachusetts. That one is being led by the USGS. And in that case, we're essentially combining 2 kinds of marine CDR, one called blue carbon, and the other being ocean alkalinity enhancement to try and maximize the carbon removal potential of marsh restoration. But our other 2 projects that we're involved with were both developed by the startup Vesta. Those 2 projects, one is in New York and one is in North Carolina. And in this case, Vesta is again trying to drive ocean alkalinity enhancement through the placement of a mineral called olivine on or near coastlines. So I'm going to be focusing the rest of my talk today on really the 2 Vesta projects, partly because they're just further along than the Marsh project, but also because prior to founding Hourglass, I was the chief scientist at Vesta. And so my experiences with these trials go all the way back to the beginning, where I led the scientific analysis during permitting, and in many cases was the person on the ground working with communities during project development. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be sort of mixing and matching my experiences pre and post forming Hourglass. Bear with me on that. Okay, so throughout all of my experiences, one thing that I've learned to be unequivocally true is that community engagement is a critical aspect of field trial development and execution. So I once gave a talk titled, "For CDR field trials, community engagement is more important than science," which I was at that moment chief scientist at Vesta, and so that was intended to be a bit of a provocative title, but it was also intended to just really drive home that the point that without engagement, and good engagement in particular, field trials, they don't happen, or even if they do happen, they're not going to happen again. So you can have all the best science in the world and all of the best intentions, but without good engagement, it's kind of all moot. So I am not a social scientist. I want to be clear. Sarah is the person for that. But I have had the privilege of working with some very talented social scientists during my career. And so I thought I'd share an engagement framework that I co-developed for Marine CDR based on some of the work we did for a proposed field trial in the Dominican Republic, and some of the examples of how we've now implemented that framework here in the United States. Okay, so kind of similar, something you saw from Sarah, a little bit different. I won't get into all of these pieces as much maybe as Sarah did, but the stakeholder engagement framework that I'll be sort of running through has 6 pieces. So stakeholder mapping, information sharing, consultation, collaboration, notification and updates, and then give back. And I'll take each one of these on one by one, but I really want to start by just highlighting how I think about engagement really, in large part, as an iterative cycle where information is shared with communities and stakeholders. You ask for feedback and you work together on the development of a plan. You notify stakeholders of external updates to the plan, potentially through the regulatory process. And then as the next decision needs to be made, the cycle goes again. And this continues throughout the life of the project. So it's not, as I think about it, sort of a linear process. It's not a box ticking process. It's an iterative, continuous cycle. Okay, so what does this look like here in the US? Stakeholder mapping, to start there, right? So stakeholder mapping, as Sarah touched on, is all about doing the work to identify and reach out to anyone who might have a stake in that project, including, Adam touched on this, but potential project supporters, as well as opposition. My experiences have driven home that the most effective way I have found to do this is to find early on a local trusted project advocate. So I'm showing here a picture of two wonderful gentlemen. These two gentlemen, they were, Guido and Aaron, were absolutely critical in the successful engagement around Vesta's New York uh, pilot. So Aram, in this case, he was a he is a trusted coastal project developer that that community had been working with for years. Guido was a representative from the local homeowners association who had spent his career as an environmental consultant, and so he was able to really quickly pick up on the science behind, what we were trying to do with a really strong understanding of the environmental benefits and risks, and then help with the communication of that to the rest of the stakeholder groups that we worked with. So having Aram and Guido were, I mean, it's hard to describe the impact that these two gentlemen had, and I'm deeply grateful for their contributions in connecting us with groups from everyone you see here on this list, both at the local and state level. Now, of course, once you know who your stakeholders are, the next step is information sharing. The goal being here to ensure that all parties have access to the same information for an informed conversation. So information sharing needs to be customized. So different locations and different stakeholders are going to require different extensive information in different forms. And I think, again, it's really important to emphasize that information sharing is bi-directional, right? It's not just project developers talking to stakeholders, but also stakeholders talking to project developers about their community, their history, their values, their concerns. And so some of information sharing is getting facts and information out to stakeholders to make them aware of the project. And in that case, the best way of doing it is going to be specific to the location. So how does that community prefer to receive information? So in New York, there were existing community notice boards that were already posted at the project site that were frequented by people walking their dogs or going for jogs. And so we use that. But when working in North Carolina, feedback from community members made it clear that they really prefer to get their information digitally and specifically through their local town newsletter and homeowners association listservs. So we use those. But again, information sharing is also intentionally creating spaces and opportunities for project developers to listen to the community. So that can include town halls and roundtables, facility tours. So in North Carolina, we both hosted community tours at our facilities. That's what you see in the bottom left-hand picture. But we also visited the facilities, right, of local NGOs and educational centers. So we went to them to stand in the places that are important to them and listen to what was important to those stakeholders. Okay, so information sharing to have an informed decision, but then you need to actually have a discussion, right? And give authentic opportunities for feedback and iteration on the project plan. So you want to avoid the circumstance, of course, where communities are just being told what is happening to them. Rather, they need a legitimate say in the project. So for me, the clearest examples from my work of seeing this in action came with regards to the sort of fundamental project design for Vesta's North Carolina trial. So basically what happened was Vesta was originally interested in building beach projects, so applying alkaline minerals to beaches. And that's what the New York trial was, and it was successful and supported by the community there. But later, when we were approaching the community in North Carolina with a similar idea, we got pretty clear feedback from the town that they would be more comfortable with an offshore project. So Vesta actually pivoted and changed the fundamental nature of the entire trial. They moved it 500 meters offshore, which had really massive ramifications for how the project was permitted, deployed, monitored, basically everything from there on out. It really changed the trajectory of that trial. And so it was a huge pivot based on that early community feedback. Um, okay, so feedback on the project from the community, and then there's actually implementing a project with the community to ensure that the project addresses their needs in practice and that the project is also, frankly, benefiting from their local knowledge. I mean, no one understands a location better than the folks that live and work there. So as in the science world, in my world, this often meant working with local scientists who had spent their careers studying that location and knew what scientific questions we needed to answer to make the work relevant for that local community. So again, some examples in New York, this meant spinning up additional field experiments, one looking at the impact of the project on oysters, and one looking at the impact of the project on horseshoe crabs. These were organisms of local interest, oysters because of the importance of the shellfish industry on Long Island, and horseshoe crabs because this is an organism that's declining on Long Island. They're really important because, among other things, their eggs are a main source of food for red knots, which are a federally endangered shorebird. So these were two species that uh, local scientists immediately picked out as something like we're gonna, to make this work relevant for the people here, we need to do this additional work and answer questions about how this project could impact these regionally important species. Okay. And then, I want to make the point that as projects move along, it's important to emphasize that engagement doesn't end once a project is permitted or built. I think it's often tempting for folks to think that this is just a box that gets ticked, for example, once you have a permit in hand, but engagement needs to continue, right? You've built a trusted relationship with the community. You need to keep them informed on an ongoing basis. Again, this is part of that iterative cycle. And, there are, of course, different ways of doing this. Here I'm showing some images from in-person events that we participated in after project deployment, where we were able to share updates on, how the project was going, what are the early data coming in, again, answer questions, that two-way dialogue. Um, but I also think there are other strategies that are important, like newsletters, right? Which they don't offer a two-way dialogue, but they can reach a much larger audience, and they require fewer resources from the community, right? So these in-person events are great, but it also requires that community members have time available, can make that time, and so having that diversity of mechanisms for engagement so that you can reach different people again in a way that's meaningful and impactful for them. It's really important. And then the last piece of the framework I want to touch on is this idea of give back, right? So ensuring that projects are not exploitive or extractive, but truly offer benefits to local communities. So give back, like many of these things, right, is customized to the location, and it can include educational opportunities or job opportunities. I've found that even having a project invest in collecting data that the project doesn't necessarily need, but that the community can benefit from. So water quality data or just other environmental data can be a really impactful give back to those communities. So I'm showing here an example from New York. We were in that project able to offer something like 10 summer internships to local high school students over the period of project monitoring, including like really cool collaborations with other wonderful institutions like Brookhaven National Lab. So yeah, creating opportunities for the local students in the community to gain research, to conduct research projects and gain just practical scientific experience and real world exposure to an emerging industry. And this is the last thing I wanted to touch on, something Adam touched on as well, is just highlighting that it takes time, right? And that's just the reality of it. It takes time. And that's because engagement, it's relationship building, it's trust building, and those are things that just don't happen overnight. So this is the actual timeline from the North Carolina field trial. And you can see here, it was 3 years between first outreach and the actual project deployment. Three years. I also think it's important to highlight that the way the engagement was conducted, you can see it here, it builds up through time, right? So the local community was brought in at the ground floor, right, for the first 8 months of the project. This is that period of time where Best actually pivoted the whole design of the field trial, was in that first 8 months of engagement. And then as time goes on, you bring in larger and larger stakeholder groups or, farther field stakeholder groups. Um, and yeah, I think, again, this is just really important for emphasizing that, you know, building those trusted relationships means working with communities early on and not, again, sort of coming in once there's already a permit in the system and they don't actually have an authentic opportunity to have a voice. So, yeah, that's what I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace. That was really interesting. Also, just looking at the timelines that both you and Adam shared is really underscoring the amount of time needed to do this well. So I want to thank all of our speakers for their presentations, and we're going to get a chance to talk to all of them more in a minute through question and answer. Before that, we're going to do our last two poll questions. So I think Lauren will activate this next one. After today's presentation, how did your opinion on how, if or how did your opinion change on mCDR field trials? Okay, and majority no change, and a minority more supportive. So great. And then our last one is we're interested in who you would like to hear from next in this webinar series so that we can help craft um, future sessions that are of interest to this group. All right, great. Okay, yes, a lot of interest in tribes. We've been talking to several tribal partners about sharing at a spring webinar series, so it's great to see that. Looks like policymakers next, opposition too. Excellent. Okay. Thanks for taking all of those polls. And then I'm going to pass it off to Lauren Linsmeyer with the California Ocean Science Trust, who's going to be moderating Q&A today.
Great. Thanks, Darcy. And thanks so much again to our wonderful speakers. Those were fascinating talks, and I'm glad we have about 20 minutes here for Q&A. And thanks to the audience for lots of great questions coming in. So we'll start there, and I think hopefully we'll have time to answer most, but if not, we can talk about ways of following up with other answers. So I wanted to start with a question from Irene in the chat that was about, and this was answered, but I think there's maybe more that we could expand upon here. Sarah's idea of working with an unbiased facilitator for community engagement and wondering if there had been any perceptions of bias, even with an unbiased facilitator, based on who's funding it. And so I'd love to hear more thoughts. And then also maybe expanding into the regional engagement hub concept and how that might help address any of these concerns or where the funding might come from for something like that. So Sarah, could we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like Adam and I have also talked about a related question, so I'm sure he has thoughts. But yeah, I mean, I guess I would say it really depends on the group, and I've had really positive interactions with folks about ocean alkalinity enhancement or about mCDR more generally, and also experienced, honestly, like quite difficult, quite difficult days or conversations where folks are really skeptical and really negative and oppositional. And I think that my personal experience has been uh, that it's been helpful to be able to say we are university researchers and like our allegiance is to research and science, and we're not here to kind of sell you on anything. We're not recording this conversation so that we can go back to the developer and help them improve their marketing of this tech to you. Uh, so that's kind of informing in part my perception that really being able to firmly ground facilitation in a from a place of sort of neutrality is really helpful for those types of folks. In my experience, more public sample folks than sort of maybe like a more environmental NGO type of audience or participant group. Um, but yeah, that can be really helpful. And I guess in terms of the regional hubs, I mean, I wrote a paper about this like a year ago that proposed a national engagement body that feels unfathomable to me right now in the US context. So that's part of why I'm thinking about it more as like a regional hub. I think there's been some interesting ideas in the Pacific Northwest with some of the conversations that we've been having. I see Meg Chadsy's on the call. She's the lead for our OCB mCDR node, but we've been talking a lot about ideas of test bed, a regional sort of test bed approach, and basically sort of thinking at a regional level around the science, the sort of physical science of mCDR. And I think it makes a lot of sense to pair that conversation with a sort of social science engagement piece as well. Um, and I don't know about funding. I think that I could see I could see a lot of different options, but probably need to come from some creative amalgam of philanthropy and, non-federally funded actors right now. But I'd love to hear what Grace and Adam have to say as well if they have thoughts.
Yeah, I can take a shot at this. I totally echo a lot of what Sarah is saying. I think the where the money is coming from is certainly something that comes up in our conversations a lot. I think the fact that this is a carbon market and there, especially with ocean alkalinity enhancement, there aren't clear, like, there aren't very clearly defined co-benefits for the communities involved. I think the alleviation of ocean acidification is sort of one in theory, but there isn't a whole lot of research to actually demonstrate that ocean alkalinity enhancement does have that co-benefit and it relieves that stress. I think that would be a really important research priority to go after to really sort of identify what that actually looks like in practice. Um, and so, but we've even got, I mean, the value of science, I think, is something that a lot of us share, but it is not shared broadly by certainly in the U.S. as something that's valuable to do, and it is being supported by federal funds. And so even in some of these communities, right, you will get skepticism about the use of federal funds for research. And that is a concern that people have. Um, and we've certainly run into that as well as just independent academic researchers. So it really depends on who you're talking to um, and what you can expect in terms of potential biases, perspectives on the value of even research, let alone the sort of commercialization of this. I'll also say that the sort of regional hub perspective, incorporating regional bodies is also very highly context specific in terms of where you are in the US. Here in the Northeast, um, we have a history of sort of poor, I wouldn't say poor, but sort of, um, uh, a not so clean trajectory in terms of community engagement, especially around conversations with offshore wind. And that has really colored the regional conversation around what engagement even looks like. Stepping into that, dealing with these same communities, these same groups of ocean users, with these very sort of now tightly held preconceived notions around the value of additional ocean uses, how those are going to overlap with the largest commercial activity in the region, which is fishing, and therefore which bodies are going to want to get involved in facilitating that conversation from a community perspective, from a political perspective. So while, on the West Coast, it seems like a lot of the cans are actively supporting this work, that is not true on the East Coast. And so even identifying which regional body that might be that could help sort of establish a deliberative body or anything like that, I think is going to be very, very regionally specific and will face its own sort of very specific, geopolitical challenges and benefits, right? But it's going to be very different depending on where you are.
Grace, anything you wanted to add about funding for this work, or who should be involved in any regional sort of coordinated effort?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think that the thing I wanted to add was, in the experiences I had actually, moving through the engagement process, when I was at Vesta, I did not have the benefit of being able to say I was an independent party with no commercial motive, right? So different from what Adam and Sarah are talking about. But I think, we were still, largely successful there. And so I think if I could articulate why I think that's the case is because people know when your engagement is performative, basically. People know it's not like when you show up and the permit's already been submitted and they don't, people know that they don't really have a voice. So I think that's the emphasis on, I think you can do this without, independent parties necessarily. And I think you can do this even if you're not a research institute. It just, you have to really double down on doing it well. And with regards to the question of funding, I agree. People definitely want to ask the question, where does the funding come from? And when you're doing this as a commercial entity, the funding is coming from investors and not the federal government. And that has its own can of worms. But I think, again, just being honest with people and transparent and people can tell when you're trying to hide things, right? So sharing information, even for hard questions, people in my experience can see the honesty and appreciate the honesty and the transparency.
Thanks, all. That's actually a great segue into one of our next questions, which I'm going to kind of tie into a broader question around incorporating community engagement into research or proposal design. So maybe starting with you, Adam, your community engagement didn't appear to be initially part of your original research goals for this OAE project, but did end up being a big part of the process. So how should mCDR researchers be thinking about incorporating community or public engagement or social science perspectives into their research design and goals? And just to tie in the question that was asked, for projects that are grant funded, what is your view on community engagement at this proposal development stage?
Yeah, totally. Well, I will say that we did do some initial engagement before we submitted the proposal, just around, again, sort of kind of like what Grace was saying, like a sort of stakeholder mapping approach, and just sort of evaluating who was there, what various groups, positions might be, and starting to sort of establish those relationships. We also, have the advantage of being, known in the community and having a lot of established relationships with a lot of the key groups in the region. That those networks, those resources have been valuable to us in terms of knowing who to talk to, finding those two guys, right, for us, who could be local champions. of the work. And I think one of the things from our perspective is we went into this not really, to be totally honest, not really knowing how sort of nationally focused our project would become. And so the level of sort of exposure that we had, I think, also generated um, the amount of engagement that we've really had to do to socialize and just sort of explain what mCDR is. We've taken on a lot of that. I would say I think at the federal level, a lot more could be done. I think NOAA is really well positioned to really set out the sort of state of play and what mCDR is and some of the details here and lead in terms of educating the public just around ocean science and what mCDR is. They've done a great job of that with ocean acidification and are well positioned to do that for marine CDR. And so I do also want to say that a lot of this has fallen onto these projects, but that shouldn't necessarily be the right model moving forward. In terms of incorporating that community feedback, we actually had these really interesting sets of conversations with regulators, with fishermen, and then coming back to these existing monitoring data sets, these long-term monitoring data sets, being able to evaluate baselines of ocean ecology, et cetera, has led to we were about to submit a paper that's all about that, right? And so as Grace said, there is a sort of two-way feedback here where you can take that feedback, iterate on the science, produce something new, and come back to those communities with information and be like, hey, actually what you told us is totally borne out by this regional 50-year data set, right? I think that's a really cool part of this engagement, that it's essentially a really expanded version of peer review, which I think is a really it's been incredibly productive, I would say, for us. And then again, in terms of incorporating ways internships, summer projects, for us, thinking about ways to incorporate, sampling with fishing vessels, et cetera, these sort of these other approaches, these are all sort of on the table as great ways to incorporate and get back in terms of that the science to these communities.
Great, thanks, Adam. For the sake of time, we'll try to squeeze in a few more here. We had another question in the chat from Judith, who's involved in a German mCDR project where they are trying to assess different mCDR approaches in terms of their feasibility and desirability. And they're wondering how the current sort of landscape in the US, you could say policy, governance landscape and climate might be affecting strategies for public communication of mCDR. So some of your projects happened, earlier. Would strategies for communicating about mCDR be different today in light of our newer context? And feel free, anyone who's interested in taking that one first, to go off chat. Is it too early to tell?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think it's just we're just trying to figure this out and understand what this landscape is even looking like. But the one thing that I will say is that there was a congressional hearing on marine CDR last year that had the question and answer in that hearing was quite interesting and quite bipartisan, actually. And so while climate science is clearly political, ocean science is clearly political, this field is clearly political, that doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be a political alignment to this research and even potential deployments. So I think we are all, as is everyone, sort of just seeing how this all plays out and how we might have to adjust moving forward.
Great. Also a question we got about who have been sort of the main sources of disinformation on mCDR. if you're comfortable sharing what types of groups or where you're seeing the most disinformation occur.
I guess I can lead too. I would say that it comes from sort of two main perspectives. One is sort of people who take this moral hazard argument and say this is just an excuse for polluters to continue emitting CO2, and that as the basis of a sort of anti-carbon removal and anti-geoengineering perspective. Um, and then there are, other groups and organizations who see this other ocean use as sort of impinging on the freedom to continue using the ocean in the way that they've seen it overall. I think there is also an aspect of the sort of in my backyard kind of thing that comes out with some of this. It's all new, right? And so a lot of this is just showing up and explaining what's going on, and being, like Grace said, being honest. I think that's really important, and it's really important to build trust with these communities, no matter what people's perspectives are.
I can also say just a couple things. I mean, I think absolutely disinformation is a thing and is something, we should be correcting for and trying to address and seeing as a problem. But I also think yeah, Holly Buck, who's a social scientist on sort of carbon removal more generally, has been thinking and writing about this a bit. And I think pushing back a little bit on the narrative that disinformation is the problem. I think, there's a lot of issues that people might raise that are pretty valid, concerns to have, and taking those seriously rather than seeing them as things that are rooted in like lack of information or misinformation or disinformation is a pretty helpful angle to take. I mean, it's a different thing to be sitting with folks who, don't believe that climate change is anthropogenic, and that's a disinformation problem. It needs to be addressed by trying to do your best to share different information. But I think that there's other questions around like what is too much intervention in the ocean, or what are what is an what crosses the threshold to being something that's too risky that are not as easily resolved, and I think really just need to be listened to and taken seriously as we've been discussing with everyone on the panel today.
I'd love to move to another question in the chat from Sherry, and I think let's start with Grace for this one, please. So wondering, are there opportunities to incorporate citizen or community science into mCDR field trials?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes. I think it's going to look different for different kinds of MCDR field trials. But there's so much it's finding what's of interest to, again, the local communities and figuring out how you can incorporate that into a monitoring plan. And I can think about some examples from the work that we did where, adding alkaline minerals to these coastlines, there's the potential for potential for impact on marine life, right? And so trying to partner, for example, with some of the community groups that are focused around some of the charismatic species, you got sea turtles and things like that, to incorporate some of the learnings from those kinds of community groups and the work that they're already doing, and then support them additionally, and find ways to leverage the two projects together can be really impactful. And then there's all the way down to, I don't know, I talked about how in New York we had a oyster experiment. We had just local community members like working with us on a weekly basis, going around and helping us flip oyster bags and just get involved, like literally get their hands in the sand. These were really impactful ways that, it was helpful to the science and helpful to the research, and also helped create that connectivity with folks who are interested in the science in the local community. So I think it'll look different though for a project like Adams, like offshore. So maybe you can speak to that, but.
Yeah, thanks for those examples, Grace. And looking at the clock, we'll unfortunately have to end it there, even though we have a few more questions in the chat and hopefully can find a way of connecting you all to the speakers for any follow-up. But with that, really wanted to thank our speakers, Sarah, Adam, and Grace. Again, thank you all so much for attending the webinar. We welcome any feedback, additional questions, or suggestions for this series, and we'll take all of the poll questions to heart. And we will also be emailing a more extensive survey to all past webinar attendees for input going forward and to get to know the community better. So stay tuned. A recording of this webinar will be available on YouTube and the CPAN, Alaska OA Network, and OST websites. And yeah, stay tuned for an announcement on our next webinar in this series. Thank you all again and have a great rest of the day.